My name is Will Hitchcock. I teach in the history department. I'm going to be the chair tonight of this panel, and the title of the panel is Iraq and America 6 months after. Generally speaking, about 6 months since the arrival of American troops into Baghdad on April 9. I guess it's 5 months and 3 weeks, but this was the best we could do. I'd like to say thank you before we start to the Committee on Lectures and Cultural Events and to the International Relations Program for providing the funding that made this event possible. I also want to point out that this event is being recorded for future broadcast on the Internet through Wellesley's participation with WGBH Forum Network at wgbh.org. So, welcome people on the Internet. This is also being simulcast, I think, so there may be many others who are watching tonight. When I drive to Wellesley College in the morning, I pass through Sherborne, and I always drive past the Peace Abbey. I don't know if you all know about the Peace Abbey, but it's an interesting place. You should look into it. Today I noticed there was a sign on their gate saying that October 2nd is the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. And I thought that it seemed appropriate that on a day such as this we would be discussing issues of war and peace. And I dare say Gandhi would have a few choice words to say about American foreign relations these days. But this is the man who, after all, when asked by a journalist what he thought of Western civilization, said, "I think it would be a very good idea." And I think, actually, Gandhi's comment goes to the heart, in a way, of what we're trying to do here tonight. What is at stake in Iraq is more than just the security issues, more than just the strategic picture, though that is important. It seems to me that people are fiercely engaged in the issue of Iraq and of American foreign relations in the world, because through that prism, through the prism of the Iraq debate, we are debating what role the U.S. should play in the world, and indeed what American civilization really is all about, and whether or not it is something that we should work to spread to other peoples and countries. And tonight we have a really outstanding group of people to help us work through some of these, this big question, to help us try to assess the Iraq war, what has happened in the past 6 months since its sort of semi-conclusion, and also to talk about the big picture and the big issues about what America is doing, not just in Iraq, but in the wider world as well. Let me introduce the panelists, and then we'll get right into their remarks. First, I'm going to ask Michael O'Hanlon to speak. He is, I think, the only one of our panel who has actually been to Iraq. He's just come back from Iraq quite recently, just in the last week or so. He has penned a reasonably optimistic assessment of what he found there, and you can read that at the Brookings website, brookings.edu. I recommend it to you. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institute. He specializes in U.S. defense strategy, military technology, homeland security, Northeast Asian security issues, and humanitarian intervention. He has published a really quite remarkable number of superb quality articles and books, and I urge them upon you if you have a time to go in and look at his quite stunning CV at the Brookings website. He has a PhD from Princeton. He also spent some time in the Congo as a Peace Corps volunteer. Next, Katherine Moon will speak. She is the Jane Bishop Associate Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College and a non-resident scholar at the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. She's the author of Sex Among Allies, Military Prostitution in U.S.-Korea Relations. She's also published other work on women and international relations, migrant workers, and social movements in East Asia. She's writing a book on anti-Americanism in South Korea. She received a Fulbright Senior Research Fellowship in Korea to conduct her research, and she was a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center in Washington this past academic year. Next, we'll have remarks from Tom Cushman, who is professor of sociology here at Wellesley College and founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Human Rights. And much of his published work over the last 10 years has focused on the issue of Western intervention in situations of gross violations of human rights, with particular emphasis on the failure of Western institutions and political organizations to deal adequately with the problem of genocide. And Tom Cushman will be followed by Professor Paul Kennedy of Yale. He is one of this country's most distinguished historians and political commentators. He's also my former teacher, and he's a dear friend, and it's lovely to have him up here from New Haven. He is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History at Yale. He is the Director also of International Security Studies at Yale. He is the author of over a dozen major works, I should say, of international history, and literally hundreds upon hundreds of essays, articles, and opinion pieces dealing with international politics. His book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which was published in 1987, was an international bestseller. It remains a classic, and in fact, some of you in the audience know it all too well because I've asked you to read it for History 295. So here is the man who is putting you through all of your pain. Get him to sign your copy afterwards. Professor Kennedy is also a monthly columnist for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, and he regularly publishes articles in many periodicals like the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian and New York Review of Books and many others. He is now writing a book on changing ideas about the United Nations. And those of you who would like to ask questions on that topic, I urge you to do so in light of his own interests and academic scholarly work. The format's going to be as follows. I'll ask each speaker to speak for 10 minutes or so. Then I'll ask them if they would like to respond to one another, to the comments that they have made briefly, and then we'll try to open it up as quickly as possible to you. Now, we have two microphones down here at the front of the room, and sometimes it's a little awkward and a little intimidating to come down the aisles and speak into the microphones, but I would ask you, if you want to ask questions or make statements, brief ones, do come down to these microphones, because otherwise the webcast people, our good friends at WGBH and all the rest of the world that's watching, won't be able to hear you. So do come down and speak into the microphones after our speakers have had a chance to make their comments. So I'd like to ask Michael O'Hanlon if he'd like to comment first, and we'll go right through the first panelist. Michael.
Thank you, Will. It's a real treat to be here back at my wife's alma mater in a place I've enjoyed visiting several times before, and to speak on this very important topic with this great panel. This really is, as you all are well aware, getting to be a bit of an ugly time in the American political debate over how Iraq is going. Largely because people had sharply divergent views going into the conflict about whether the war was appropriate or necessary or desirable. I'm not going to focus so much on that piece. I want to try to give a little bit of my sense of how things are going in Iraq now, and I don't want to put on a big sell job. Because, again, the debate in the United States I see is getting very polarized, and this is not necessarily all that good of a thing, in my judgment. People who tended to oppose the war see what's going wrong in Iraq, and there certainly is plenty going badly. People who favor the war can only talk about how it's going faster than the Marshall Plan or faster than the recovery of Germany and Japan after World War II. And you get these dueling invocations or uses of factoids on opposing sides of the debate. And the last thing I want to do is just be one more participant in that discussion. So what I'd like to do is to present, and to be brief as well, present a little bit of what I learned in Iraq last week, and also just what I've been trying to deduce from my studies from afar about how things are going. Will is right that I am a guarded optimist, but I think to be useful to you, what I should do is try to say why, and to try to break down my thinking in a little bit more specificity and give you some information that I was able to, I hope, gather while I was in Iraq. Although it was a very short trip, and I don't want to claim to be an Iraq expert after 3 days in the country. But let me also say, in the interest of full disclosure, that this was a Pentagon-sponsored trip, and we spent most of our time, although not all of it, with with military personnel. Now, we had plenty of opportunity to ask these people prying, tough questions, and some of them I knew from before. One of them was a former classmate of Kathy's and mine at the Woodrow Wilson School, the commanding general of the 101st Air Assault Division, Dave Petraeus. He started graduate school the same year I did in 1984 at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. In 1991, I got my degree. He got his in like 86 or 87. It took him about 2.5 years to get a PhD. He's a fantastic guy, and you can see how much he's doing well up in the northern part of Iraq, in the city of Mosul and vicinity, where he really is acting in sort of the best spirit of a warrior and a Peace Corps volunteer and everything in between, all in one person. And we're getting a bit of that in the effort in Iraq, and I think it's one of the reasons why there is at least some room for hope. But anyway, So that the backdrop to the trip is it was Pentagon-sponsored, but the idea was to give us enough access to these sorts of individuals in off-the-record conversations that we could push, pry, ask them if they really believed what Mr. Rumsfeld was saying back home, if they really thought things were going well, what they worried about most, etc. Okay, let me break things down a little bit into the security situation in Iraq and the counterinsurgency campaign against former Saddam loyalists as well as foreign terrorists who are infiltrating into Iraq. That's one piece of it. That's the part where I'm actually the most optimistic. Secondly is the economic recovery. And we all know from studying insurgency and counterinsurgency that economic conditions and political conditions are a very important determinant of whether you can defeat this kind of an insurgency, because to the extent the population feels disenfranchised and frustrated and unhappy with how things are going, they're more likely to join the ranks of the guerrilla movement, obviously, and defeat your efforts to gradually weaken it, contain it, and go after it. And so the economic issues are quite important. Here I am a little frustrated by the pace of progress, and this is one reason why, even though I'm a Democrat who tends to be critical of Mr. Bush, I'm very much on his side, at least in broad thrust, on the $87 billion appropriation now before Congress. There's plenty of room to discuss the specifics of that and for Congress to criticize, scrutinize, and improve. But the basic thrust of the idea that you have to get a lot of resources into Iraq quickly, I think, is unassailable on basic grounds of trying to improve that country and get our own troops out. The third piece is the basic political concept that we're trying to help the Iraqis get towards themselves as they work from their governing council, the national coalition government, if you will, right now, towards a constitution and then towards elections. This is the part where I'm a little more nervous, because we're essentially trying to create a cohesive democracy out of a country that hasn't been that before, certainly hasn't been anything like that in the modern era. And I think there are plenty of reasons to worry that it's going to be hard to create a strong enough sense of Iraqi national cohesion and strong enough Iraqi security forces to hold the country together once we leave. I don't think we'll leave for 3 to 5 years, and it may even be longer than that. During that period of time, we'll gradually reduce American forces and we'll give more political control to the Iraqis, certainly as quickly as possible. But we'll have to have troops there, I think, for a while. My fear is even after 3 to 5 years, there's some danger of the country breaking apart. Okay, a couple more details on each of these three issues, and then I'll stop. In terms of security, why am I relatively optimistic? Well, again, this is not just based on data, and it's certainly not based on any huge knowledge I have based on 3 days in Iraq last week. But if you look at counterinsurgency campaigns in history, usually you're in relatively in good shape as the country trying to win the counterinsurgency if the ideology and motivation of your opponent is weak. I do not believe that the Iraqi insurgency has a plausible motivation right now to turn into a snowballing, larger guerrilla movement. There aren't that many people who want to bring back the former regime, and of those who really do, frankly, we're arresting and killing a lot of them on a daily basis. The overall insurgency in this sense is actually being weakened. Obviously, it's not a pretty thing. We are still at war. We know this from the number of American troops still losing their lives. We know this from the number of Iraqi Ba'athist and former Saddam loyalists who are still fighting us, but generally, on balance, losing the battles. So it is a country at war, but basically it's a residual element of anything from 10,000 to 50,000 former Saddam loyalists that we are facing, and we have probably arrested or killed something close to 10,000 of them in the last 6 months. I don't want to sound like I'm giving you a body bag measure. Anybody who studied Vietnam history knows how dangerous it is to be talking in the terms I'm using right now. I don't want to quantify progress in a guerrilla campaign by body bag counts too much, and yet the fact of the matter is I think we are using force in a fairly careful and selective way, and I think based on prisoner interrogations and the growing number of Iraqis who are prepared to talk to us and give us intelligence, we can be somewhat confident that we're going after the right people in general. And I think there aren't that many of them. In terms of foreign jihadists, this is in some ways a bigger worry. Mr. Bush's claim, which I don't fully buy or even buy much at all, that al-Qaeda was linked to Saddam and that this has become the global battleground against al-Qaeda and global fundamentalist terrorism. I don't really buy that argument for Mr. Bush, but nonetheless there is an element of truth to the point or to the assertion that al-Qaeda and others are perhaps trying to infiltrate because they know that a couple 100,000 Westerners are now available as targets inside of Iraq. Let's try to go after them where they are. And this is certainly a worry because we know that the broader al-Qaeda movement in the world has tens of thousands of members. To the extent many of these people can get inside of Iraq, it's obviously a great concern for us. However, we are deploying more and more Americans near the borders trying to prevent the inflow. We are training Iraqis to do that for us and do that for themselves as time goes on. These training programs are finally starting to accelerate and make some progress. We got a long ways to go, but we're making some progress. And the number of foreign jihadists inside of Iraq today, I believe, is from what people can best estimate, in the range of maybe a couple thousand. It may be a few thousand. It's very hard, obviously, to count these sorts of military figures and facts, but nonetheless, it seems that the numbers are relatively limited. For example, I visited Saddam's hometown of Tikrit last week, and the commanding general there, Major General Ray Odierno, told us that in the last few weeks, they haven't found that many foreign jihadists, and they haven't found that many former Saddam loyalists from Tikrit. Most of the people there still fighting are Sunni Arab extremists who have been imported into Tikrit from places like Fallujah and Baghdad because the Tikrit element is actually largely defeated, and the foreign element is not that large. So this is part of the Sunni triangle, and we're seeing some real progress in that area. Again, there's a long ways to go, and no one really knows how far we still have to go. You can't count enemy assets very easily in this sort of a counterinsurgency, but the overall gist I get is there's no rallying ideology that's really plausibly going to unify Iraqis unless we do such a bad job that anti-Americanism becomes that ideology. I know there are a lot of people in this community across the country who are now worried that anti-Americanism could become that rallying ideology for Iraqi extremists to take up arms against us, and I acknowledge there is some reason for that worry, but the overall evidence I see so far is that most people are still glad that Saddam's gone, and even if they are frustrated with us and not that happy with us, they are unlikely to take up arms against us, especially if we can begin to improve the quality of life. I'm already up to 10 minutes. Let me just say 30 seconds each more on the economic issue and the political issue. On the economy, electricity levels are still too low. They're beginning to recover, but they're not very high. Unemployment is still way too high. We really have to jumpstart this. I'm really just going to make the one simple point now that whether you favor Mr. Bush or not, whether you favor the $87 billion or not, whether you get involved a lot in congressional debates and writing to your congressman or not, I would encourage you to get involved in this issue because we need constructive thinking on this. The sort of, if you're for Mr. Bush, you vote for it. If you're against Mr. Bush, you vote against it. This is not acceptable as a way for our country to handle this issue. If the $87 billion proposal is not the right one, we need a better one. But we need to rebuild the Iraqi economy because otherwise there is no hope of giving the Iraqi people a better future and of winning the counterinsurgency campaign. And we got to do it fast. One point on the politics, and I'll stop. The real problem here, as many of you know, there are probably two main problems. One is the potential for the Shia, who are the majority in Iraq, in the south, to become radicalized and move in the direction of an Iranian theocracy. I think that fear is relatively contained at the moment, but you never know. And the other fear, which is much more real, is the Sunni Arabs, of which Saddam is one, of course, really don't feel like they're getting a fair shake. And Americans know this. The military officers we talk to know that Sunni Arabs are frustrated. They're nervous they're going to be have their rights deprived from them or taken from them in a majority government that's going to be Shia-dominated, and they're going to lose the special privileges they once had. We have to figure out a way to make the Sunnis feel like their rights are protected, or there's the potential for an ongoing insurgency, and also then, once we leave, for civil warfare. I probably worry more about the civil warfare than I do about the counterinsurgency, which, as I say, I think is going reasonably well. Bottom line, it's still a war. It's still ugly. I heard a lot of American soldiers say it's still a war. You can see it from the statistics. It's still a war. Mr. Bush created for himself a problem by giving the impression the war was almost over last May 1st when he flew to the aircraft carrier. You now have Time magazine on the cover, mission not accomplished. The debate in this country about Iraq is at a very, very intense, increasingly partisan, and increasingly worrisome tone at this point, and we have to actually figure out a way to make this thing work, because while there are some positive elements, we still have a long ways to go, and we have to find a way to succeed. I'll stop there. Look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to introduce Katherine Moon. Thank you for her remarks.
Thanks, Will. I left my home about a half hour or so ago, and I heard on CNN, there was one of these CNN call-in online votes, not empirically valid, but, fun at any rate. And the question was, who is most out of touch with Iraq? 1, media. 2, U.S. commanders in Iraq. 3, Rumsfeld. And I thought the question was curious because it was put in the negative. By the way, the answer was 80% of the call-in people said Rumsfeld. But that's not the point. That's not my point. My point is that I'd like to turn that question around to the positive and hope that regardless of where we stand on these issues or what our disagreements or agreements may be, that we will all end up being more in touch on Iraq through this occasion rather than out of touch on Iraq. I told Will that I would speak about Iraq and U.S. policies in Iraq as they relate or as they connect with or lead us to other issue areas, particularly North Korea. As many of you know, the Iraq-North Korea crises have been happening in tandem. And I'm going to do something I never do. One, I never predict things, and I ended up predicting something for the LA Times. They wanted an op-ed in January. And I have to say that I don't think I was proved wrong yet, but I'm going to share a little bit of these past thoughts with you as a way to shed light on some future implications. So I'm going to read a little bit to you. I had written this in January. While American families kiss their loved ones in uniform goodbye to go the long way toward Iraq, minority voices in the U.S. and South Korea call for U.S. troop withdrawal from the peninsula. Troops are being deployed to the Middle East with a war-fighting strategy in mind, but calls for removal of troops from Korea are knee-jerk responses based neither on strategic assessment nor political analysis. And that was my understanding of U.S. policy considerations toward Korea at the time. As many of you know, Iraq and North Korea have been lumped together by President Bush as the axis of evil back 2 years ago during the State of the Union address. And last year rather, and this State of the Union address also President Bush referred to lessons to be learned from the Korean Peninsula for Iraq. I don't agree with some of the lessons he drew in his State of the Union address, but I'd like to talk about lessons I think are important. And again, when I was thinking about these, I was looking ahead back in January toward the possibility that we would engage in war in Iraq and have the crisis on the Korean Peninsula that still continues. What have we learned, in my view, from the U.S. military experience in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, with the 37,000 or so U.S. troops continuing to be stationed there from 1954 on? We had more troops in the past, but at this point about 37,000 troops. And as many of you know, last winter we saw very public, very emotional outpourings of South Korean protests against the presence of U.S. troops and an increasing public airing of what we might call anti-American sentiments. This is considered astonishing to many American and Korean observers simply because South Korea has proved to be one of America's staunchest allies during the Cold War, a place where American blood was shed, and a place that was known to have been saved partly through the help of the United States. So what lessons? One, from the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. experience in Korea. One, do not expect gratitude. And this is a lesson that I had in mind before we went into Iraq. If a country that we helped save from communism and that we have had a military alliance with for 50 years, if that population changes over time and can grow to be anti-American and very critical of U.S. interests in Asia and elsewhere, there's no reason to have believed back in January for me that we would fare better in Iraq, where Iraqis did not call us in and where we had no public evidence of actual threats to the United States, as we are now finding out. The second point is that lots of people outside the U.S., and I feel funny sitting next to Professor Kennedy here saying this, but most of us Americans have relatively short historical memory compared to many outside of the U.S. and more still traditional societies relative to the U.S. And the history is important, I think, particularly when it comes to the connection between personal and political. This may sound odd when we're talking about war, but my point is very simple, that the everyday acts that U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops perform and do not perform in a place get remembered by civilians. Both good acts, acts of kindness, acts of courage and heroism, as well as acts of neglect, acts of arrogance, acts of illegal acts, engaging in prostitution in Asia now is one of the main sources of anti-Americanism as a legitimating factor for some of the social protests against the United States military presence. People remember, and they pass down what they remember to their children and their families, both the good stories of American aid as well as the negative stories. I agree with Mike here that it is, regardless of our stance on whether we should have entered the war or not, it is imperative that we fulfill the responsibility, since we have entered Iraq under these circumstances, to help in the reconstruction process as much as possible so that people can get back on their feet, get on with their lives, and we try to reduce as much of the negative memories as possible. The third point is that if we want to help institute democracy, be prepared in the medium and long term for lots of criticism. And South Korea is a very good example of this. The U.S. is very good at spreading democracy. I don't think it's terribly good at nurturing democracy, and I think Iraq will be a very important test case for us. South Korean democracy in the last 15, 18, 19 years has proved to be not very welcoming of the United States. As democracy grows in South Korea, again one of the staunchest allies during the Cold War and one of America's closest military alliances and friends, you have increasing civil society activism with independent information and reflection looking at the U.S. presence in Korea and East Asia very, very critically. If we want to help build democracy, we have to be prepared for criticism. Even if the insurgency movement in Iraq does not gain much more strength, as Mike O'Hanlon is suggesting, I think it's important to keep in mind what we see now doesn't necessarily turn out to be the case 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now when history writes itself differently. Right after the U.S. military occupation of Korea, in the liberation of Korea from Japanese colonial rule, right at the end of World War II, the U.S. military spent a lot of resources chasing out local Korean communists in the southern portion of Korea as well as northern. That was considered desirable by many South Koreans at the time. Now, 40, 50 years later, people are looking at that history differently and questioning the brutality and the near massacres that occurred of local insurgents, local rebels. So again, history will treat us differently, I think, whether we look at Iraq today, 5 years from now, 10, 20 years from now. The other related point is that generations change, and with that, the interpretation of history. So we don't know for sure what the feedback will be based on what's going on today, and it's something to be vigilant about, that our actions today will definitely, actions and inactions will definitely affect how history judges us in the future in Iraq and elsewhere. I have several points here in terms of lessons of Iraq or from Iraq for other policy areas of contention. And this is a way to reverse the course that I just started. One, that questionable intelligence to justify military action is not something that has been happening in Iraq, but also regarding North Korea. Just as we are now finding out that we are not seeing the weapons of mass destruction that were promised by the Bush administration prior to the war as rationale for going into the war, we have another case regarding North Korea where the U.S. government has been using the figure of 2 nuclear bombs as near truths. In fact, we do not know for sure how many nuclear bombs North Korea has. The 2 that people throw around are based on intelligence estimates that are 10 years old. And so if we are to engage in military intervention on the Korean Peninsula, we need to question again the validity, the veracity of the intelligence that is supposed to justify military intervention. The second point is that action, U.S. actions based on ignorance of the history and a culture of a different society and self-selected reality on the part of the U.S. is not a very desirable reality. Right now, we are acknowledging in the post-Iraq war situation the shortage of area and country experts to help figure out what's going on in Iraq. But prior to the war, area and country experts were marginalized and shunned by the Bush administration. This is also happening with the Korean Peninsula, that scholars and other experts who, with linguistic and other kinds of know-how, are not necessarily being engaged by our government leaders, and rather people who do not have a lot of in-depth knowledge are being tapped for information. One scholar I know called the problem in Washington a proliferation of non-proliferation experts. And I think there's some truth to that non-proliferation experts are driving U.S. policy significantly, and that we need to have, and it's appropriate that we talk about this at a liberal arts college, we need to have deep historical, cultural, linguistic understanding of a place through area and country experts. And that's for Iraq as well as North Korea and other parts of the world. My third point here regards what is going on at home. I think the process by which we entered the Iraq war has not been a democratic process at all. Most of us Americans were cowed into the war. We did not have the time or the chance to deliberate on the issues, partly because we did not have information. I think anti-democratic policy processes are not good for policy or for democracy. The lack of transparency is now coming to haunt us, but also disregard for alternative interpretations, policy suggestions, critiques from outside the White House and the Pentagon, as well as from within the White House and Pentagon. Criticism is not taken well by the small cohort of people running our country. I think this is not a good thing for the United States. And for those of you who study international relations, we study that democratic peace, the democratic peace theory, rests on the premise that the deliberative process occurs in democracies so that one or a group of leaders do not drag a country into war or into undesirable conflicts. So again, some thoughts about extending our lessons from Iraq so far to other areas of conflict as well as here at home. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. I noticed in the blurb for this session that it was touted as a chance to dissect the war, but it's clear it's not dead yet. And, it's very much something that's an ongoing process. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the recent data that I've been able to cull from the situation there. But before I do that, perhaps engage in some paraphilosophical meanderings about my particular position on the war, without going into the issues of the justification for it, which are really is not our purpose here. But I think it's important for me to make that point that I was one of a small group of people, at least on this campus anyway, who tried to articulate what I considered to be a liberal justification for the war, up prior to the war, during the war, and now in the Reconstruction phase. And what I mean by that is more of a tradition of liberal internationalism, more traditional kind of liberal internationalism, which sees itself first and foremost as anti-fascist. It's a very great and noble tradition of liberalism in the 20th century. And I'm not alone in that regard. And I'm saying this because I think it's important for what I'm going to argue about what our ethical obligations might be in the present context. And I'll maybe reflect on some of the comments that were made here in order to do that. I should be very clear as well that one of the reasons I supported the use of force in this particular situation in contravention of the Security Council was that after given my particular research on looking at the sociology of Western intervention, I guess, I wasn't very sanguine after looking at Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, those three situations at least. I could probably go on about that. I wasn't very sanguine about the UN's the possibility of trusting the UN in such a in terms of security and self-defense, and that was, basically, we can bring that up later, the issue of whether or not this was self-defense. That's a very thorny issue right now, and that's part of the ongoing issue about the war, I think, that divides people. I would only say that there is from the point of view of American customary law and from the point of view of American statutory constitutional law, the war was entirely legal. And if you want to ask me why that is, we can do that in the question and answer period. But the issue for me is, the more general issue for me is somewhat of a human rights argument. And it's a problematic argument because the issue is whether or not human rights should be fostered through the use of violence. It's a paradoxical issue, and traditional critics of rights, as my students who are here from my human rights class know, after reading Jeremy Bentham and Edmund Burke, their principal observation was that human rights projects almost always end in violence. And I think we're at a period now where several major human rights activists and scholars are advocating the use of violence, including myself. And I find that problematic, and I'm working through it. I'm trying to come to terms with that. But I think that's something we need to think about. Can, to paraphrase Mao Zedong, can human rights come out of the barrel of a gun? And I think that's a rhetorical question at the moment. But I have to say that I am inspired that at least part of the argument for liberal argument for humanitarian intervention, I'm inspired by a lot of the world reaction actually to the war. I think I'm not quite sure where the argument of unilateralism comes in. And there were 60 nations, nearly 60 nations that supported the war. The French and the Germans and the Russians didn't, but there were 60 members of the coalition. I don't know if people know that. There were 8 governments in Europe, including the governments, more importantly, of the former communist bloc, and I think that's significant, who supported the war. Most of the major dissidents who helped to bring down communism, and this is for our students of ancient history by now, but most of the major dissidents, people like Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, who was a pacifist actually, a nonviolent advocate of nonviolence, supported the war. So there's something there to look at, to consider at least. Why are these great liberals supporting this war? Certainly it's not the case that Bush is a great liberal. And I want to be very clear on that. I think people would agree with that at Wellesley College, almost without question. But on the other hand, there is a sense in which the project of at least the post-war situation in Iraq is a liberal project, and I want to explain what I mean by that. In my course on international justice last year, we had students reading John Rawls' The Law of Peoples, which is, a book which is, as you know, Rawls is one of the most famous liberal political philosophers of the 20th century. And the assignment was to read that book and decide what Rawls would say about the impending war. And about half the students said, I think he might have supported it. And about half the students said, I don't think he would have supported it. So what it told me, at least doing that, was that, doing that assignment, was that there could be very good arguments for what the great guru of liberal political philosophy himself would say about supporting the war. Unfortunately, he had died 2 months before that, so it was all a rather didactic kind of pedagogic exercise. It would be really interesting to know what he would have thought about that. He's very opaque on the issue of humanitarian intervention. He says a number of times in the book that it's okay to do this. He doesn't specify, at least in that book, very clearly how it goes about it. But what's more important, I think, is that if a society embarks on a course, as the United States has done, or any other society, that they have an obligation, an ethical obligation, principled, virtuous obligation to bring that society into what he calls the law of peoples, the society of peoples. It's the duty of the victor, and I think I want to stress that word, duty. People have said here that, Mr. O'Hanlon said that, almost said the same thing when you said we really do have to appropriate money, but it's not just a matter of having to. I consider it an ethical duty, and that's, I think, really important. It does bother me considerably that people who consider themselves to be liberal use the term occupation, imperialism, and connote, all the most negative qualities of the Reconstruction period, because it doesn't seem to me that a true liberal at all, at least defined in a Rawlsian sense, would advocate such a thing. That defeatism is very much out of keeping with what I consider to be the principal virtue of liberalism, which is hope and social progress. Now, there is the issue of Bush's motives and Rumsfeld's motives and all that kind. I'm not saying that their motives were humanitarian at all. That's not my argument in the least here. Who knows what their motives are? Sociologists don't believe we can ever know what people's motives are. All we can listen to is what their words are and try to figure out why they use those words. But that's a separate lecture. But I think that the consequence, at least, is the possibility of some reconstruction or construction of a liberal democratic society. I wanted to, since I'm a sociologist and I've already made some of my political and philosophical statements, I'd like to just report to you some data from a recent survey that was done by Physicians for Human Rights, which is located here in Boston, which was a co-laureate for the Ban the Landmines campaign. So most of you know this campaign. They were involved in this. Very respectable organization. They did a survey in southern Iraq of 2,000 households, interviewed about 16,000 people, that's quite a substantial sample from any sociological point of view. What they were interested in was the views of Iraqis about human rights abuses, justice, reconstruction, and government. And this is available online, and I can post it on the bulletin if you'd like to see it. I urge you strongly to read this, because it's real sociological data. And it's quite interesting, because the views of the Iraqis themselves strike me as being remarkably liberal. At least that's what they say. I mean, who knows what they really will do, but this is what they say they believe. And we don't have this vision that a lot of people who are against the war have been conjuring up as what I would consider a kind of Orientalist vision, a nod to Edward Said, who just passed this week, but this idea that they're so backward they can never possibly develop, and this kind of negativity and cynicism, which seems to me to have invaded the left and so-called liberals in ways that really disturbs me. And I'll get to that point in a moment. But that this idea, just as a mental experiment, if you went back at the end of World War II to the Reconstruction period and looked at German and Japanese society, at least off the cuff, it seems to me that those two societies didn't seem like real good candidates for democracy, especially Japan. I mean, it was an empire, it was an imperial state. So I think that liberal hope demands that we reject cultural determinism when we're thinking about this. But here's some of the data. I'll just read you some of the findings, and you'll have to excuse me because this is in like 1-point font here, so it's not my eyes, it's really the font. Okay. 2 minutes, that's good. Those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity should be punished. 98% of the survey answer that in the affirmative. Respect for civil and political liberties are critical to the successful reconstruction of Iraq. 97% felt that was the case. The rights of individuals belonging to minority groups should be respected. 97%. There should be provisions in the Constitution to protect women's rights. 96%. The UN should play the lead role in humanitarian assistance in Iraq. 87%. Not 97, but it drops, but it's still pretty respectable. And get this one. They were asked to respond to this. I support the U.S. and coalition role in establishing a new Iraqi government, 82%. Humanitarian organizations are doing a fine job of providing the people's basic needs in Iraq, 59%. And finally, the U.S. and coalition forces should not be directly involved in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, 46%. They don't trust us to do it. And what this suggests is that, at least in this sample, and this is not representative of all of Iraq by any means, but at least in this sample, that the Iraqi people themselves express not only liberal values, but also a strong desire for the United States to help them build a government. That's interesting data. They also think the UN should be more actively involved, but of course the UN has already more or less made its determination that they're not going to involve any ex post facto justification for Bush's war by supporting that. And once again, I think the people of Iraq will suffer as other people throughout the 1990s have suffered from United Nations bureaucratic lethargy and ineptitude. I should also mention that Libya is the chair of the was at least the chair of the Human Rights Committee in the UN, which tells you everything you need to know. Finally, I just would say, and this maybe since I've been a little sharp, I'll end on this. Maybe the best thing that could happen would be for Bush to go in the next election. I'm sure there would be nods of agreement on that. Maybe that would be the best thing. Maybe he's done his bit. Maybe that's it. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But I'd like to see what happens afterward. And I have to say, to make a political statement, since, everybody else around here does all the time, this is the first time I've spoken on the war in a long time, I think that a lot of the demagogues are playing a very dangerous demagogic game here by playing on anti-war sentiment, and also, it doesn't, again, to get back to my earlier point, it doesn't strike me at all as being in keeping with what I consider to be a liberal principle to want to abandon a people to some unbeknownst fate. And, I think the negativity and the cynicism, it's a political attack, of course, but I really think that it wouldn't be, in my mind, just from a liberal point of view to abandon Iraq in this important reconstruction period. And, whoever comes into office next, whether Bush remains there or the Democrats elect somebody who's against the war and wants to bring all the troops home, there's going to have to be something done. I think the ethical mandate is to stay there and to not abandon the Iraqi people to chaos. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to congratulate Professor Hitchcock for arranging this evening. When I heard of the expertise of my three colleagues on this panel, I asked him in some panic, well, what on earth should I talk about? And he said, well, you just do the bigger picture, the larger picture. And I thought, well, how large can you get, or how far out onto the thin ice does Professor Hitchcock want me to go in my little sled? But I'm going to divide my remarks, I hope, into about 2 equal 5 minutes. And I am going to talk about the bigger picture and then come on to Iraq. So I'm going to talk about the world as a whole. And I'm going to argue in these 5 minutes that I think we are a world in very considerable trouble. We entered the 21st century with 15% of the world's population owning 85% of its wealth, and with the other 85% sharing the remaining 15% of its wealth. There is probably no single greater statistic to affect our world condition than that. We entered the world of the 21st century with an increasing series of what we call failed states, of mass horrors, and of genocides in different parts of the globe. The historian of 40 or 50 years' time is going to ask, why did we spend so much time getting excited about Iraq when 2 million people were slaughtered by the Muslim government in Khartoum in the southern part of the Sudan because they were animists or Christians? Why do we spend so much time on terrorism when 5 million people have been killed in the eastern Congo in the past 7 years? These are atrocities, genocides, which the now limp United Nations system cannot deal with, despite all of the best pleas of Kofi Annan. And the reason the United Nations system cannot deal with it is not bureaucratic quarrels. It's that the 5 permanent veto members of the United Nations cannot agree together as they were meant to do according to the Constitution of 1945. And if they do not agree, you get lassitude and you get failure. We have environmental pressures building up which terrify the trousers of my colleagues at Yale in environmental science. There was a time a few years ago when conservatives would say it's not proven, global warming doesn't exist. Those voices have kind of faded away every time we open a newspaper and see another big chunk of the Arctic ice floe moving down into the Atlantic. We have global AIDS, disease, impoverishment crisis. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we came into the 21st century with a population of a mere 6 billion people. 2.5 billion were in poverty of less than $2 a day in their income. And the forecast is that we will go from that 6 billion to 9 billion in the next 50 years. And that 95% of the forecast increase will occur in the poorer parts of the world. Only then would I begin to move towards our topic. Indirectly, I would then put in the issue of global terrorism, anarchy, uncontrolled gangsterism from Peru to Indonesia. On Friday afternoon, I and my colleague John Gaddis were asked if we would meet at Yale the Singapore defense minister. When we asked him to come and see us, we said, well, what's the agenda? And he said, we in Singapore are absolutely terrified at the evidence we have of the spread of Al-Qaeda networks right through Philippines, especially in the south, right through Indonesia. We ourselves have 15% Muslim population, and chiefly Chinese Singapore, and the amount of radicalism and the hatred of America and the hatred of the West is ballooning. In this general context of large problems which can only be solved by a great deal of international wisdom and international cooperation, we have a regional war in Iraq. Whether it's going better than some of the critics say, or it's going worse than some of the critics say, I'm not going to get into that, but it is clear that it has put the United States in a very serious position internationally, vis-a-vis our normal international friends, our alliances, the Security Council of the United Nations. It's put us into a great deal of pressure militarily. The Department of Defense just confessed last week to Time magazine that the U.S. Army has now 368,000 troops. This is just the Army, not the Marines or the others. 368,000 troops abroad in 120 countries. As I came up here on the train, I was trying to work out, well, where do we not have troops abroad? Polynesia. St. Lucia, I don't think we got troops there.
He's going on vacation.
Then we have the economic issue, which I can only briefly mention. This $87 billion additional budget for Iraq, we can argue about how it should be spent, but it is being accompanied by a proposed tax cut of another $450 billion, meaning that the federal budget deficit is going up in the most impossible way. Mr. Bush likes to read Winston Churchill, and his speechwriters quote Winston Churchill. Mr. Churchill always asked not just for full commitment and national solidarity. He asked for sacrifice. He asked for additional taxes, particularly upon the rich and the broad shoulders that could bear them. It could well be we are at a low point. It could well be that these comments of mine, looking back at them 6 months' time, 2 months' time, might seem too negative, too low. I hope to God I'm wrong. I've been debating Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and the lot for the past 18 months and saying, I hope I'm wrong. But what I'm worried is that they are wrong. And what I do not see, ladies and gentlemen, is any sense that the hubris of the policymakers who took us into war has been in any way modified a bit by recognition that actually we might have been wrong. They might have been a bit too optimistic. They might have listened to the wrong sort of people about the wrong sort of people who are going to form the political parties and the council in Iraq. Therefore, I fear this administration, and perhaps it's a successor administration which has to carry the can, is faced with quite a dilemma. We either stay the course, the Wolfowitzian course in Iraq, at considerable costs, military, economic, political, personal, and diplomatic. And the diplomatic ones worry me because there are other countries in the world who can do things to screw us as well as we can do things to screw them. And the alliance of 60, always advocated by Mr. Rumsfeld, is a kind of pathetic claim. We cannot really get anything out of 112 Latvian soldiers or 100 Guatemalan policemen in Iraq other than putting them in a place of danger? It doesn't make sense. Or we can begin to rethink. We can begin to rethink of a political compromise within the country. We begin to consider the scaling down of the vast array of commitments we have. 144,000 army in Iraq, 35,000 in Kuwait, 10,000 in Afghanistan, 37,000 in Korea, 35,000 in Germany. And we can think of bringing in the international system instead of disregarding the international system. We can think of clever ways in which the founding fathers of 1945 brought in an international system because the United States did not want to go it alone. Or we could fall between those two possibilities. And that is what I really worry quite a lot about.
Thank you, Paul. All right, well, we've gone to about 8:30. Now we have half an hour, and here's what I propose. I want to give each person up here 30 seconds at most to say, I violently disagree with you, or alternatively, nice job. But what I really want to do is get you guys to come down, and you should start doing so now so that you can position yourself to make a comment, a response, a rebuttal. Now, don't be intimidated, but I urge you to come down and position yourselves now. But first thing I'm going to do as you're lining up, as you're coming down, is just ask the group if they would like to say anything. I think, with the exception of Professor Kennedy, since he had the last word, I'll ask the first three panelists if they have anything they would like to add. If not, fine. Let's get a comment from particularly the students and the others in the audience. Mike, would you like to have a word, comment, rebuttal?
Let's get to it.
Okay. Kathy?
Yep.
Same thing? Okay, let's get right to it. I'm very pleased by the way this worked. We had two people who made a savvy, intelligent, thoughtful assessment of the situation and came out feeling that things were on balance, moving in a fairly guardedly optimistic way. Others, two very subtle and important and thoughtful chidings and remarks that raised concerns, issues, and I thought in a very important, useful way. So that's nice. We've had a certain amount of balance. Now let's dispense with all the balance and let's start arguing. So please come down. Larry, please.
I was very absorbed by what you all said, but also found myself wishing that there could be some more talk about the subject that seems to be in the past for us, namely the rightness or wrongness of the war itself. I remember when Will first set this up, that seemed to be more in the horizon of the event. So I'd like to ask a specific question having to do with that, rightness or wrongness. It begins with a passage from that same Physicians for Human Rights report that Tom quoted from, and I owe my ability to quote from it to his having posted it. In that report, Physicians for Human Rights recommends that the U.S. should, to the maximum extent possible, collect information on all dead and injured in the war, civilian and soldier, and I presume Iraqi soldier and civilian, for purposes of providing maximum information to family members and affording proper burial. In the case of deaths of soldiers, this is an obligation under the Geneva Convention, the report. I'll get to my question now. I think that's a very important question. As a person opposed to the war, I was opposed to it because what I thought its human costs would be in terms of dead and injured civilians and soldiers. And so I'm wondering three questions for anybody who cared to answer them. One is, do you agree with the call that Physicians for Human Rights is making? Second, in the absence of reliable statistics, and I'm, even as an opponent of the war, dubious of the claims made on sites like Iraq body count, do you yourselves have a view about how many civilian and military dead and injured there were? And three, maybe most germanely, whatever sense you have of this matter, how does that sense of the matter bear on your assessment now of whether the war was right or wrong? Thanks.
Thank you. I think what I'm going to do is take one or two more questions so that we can have a bit of a, you guys can come up with your thoughts and reply in groups. Please.
Hi, Ashley Hicks, class of 06. I was wondering if maybe you could speak on how long you think it'll take for the U.S. to finally realize that we cannot keep neglecting Iran in our diplomatic relations, and when we do, what role they can play in the rebuilding of Iraq. Thank you.
Great. Why don't you come? Oh, Salma, would you like to speak? Yeah.
I first want to thank the panel. It was great listening to them. I have found myself over the past, I grew up in Iran, so a bit of familiarity with the Middle East. I find myself going back and forth. Like I remember, basically what I'm afraid of is the amnesia that we tend to have. Like when the war was going on, what I felt that I had blood on my hands, because if we were proven wrong 10 years or 20 years from now, then we would all be held responsible. And the other thing is, Saddam was not the best man on earth. And deciding between whether having Saddam remain as the regime or whether having the United States go into Iraq was one of the most difficult things I've come across. And I don't think I still have come to an understanding of what was better for the people of the country as opposed to everyone else thinking outside who won't be exactly influenced by the aftermath of the war. The other thing is, I want you to comment on if you can see how the crisis in the Middle East is going to be influenced by the intervention that was made in Iraq. Thank you.
When you say the crisis in the Mideast, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, right? Okay. Let's have one more, and then we'll go to responses from the group.
I don't know if any of you believe that my question has enough relevance to be answered at this specific panel, but I was just wondering if any of you had comments on the Patriot Act.
All right. While we're getting some responses and thoughts, I hope that you guys will continue to come down and make comments, because otherwise I'm going to have to ask the questions. And I have some good ones, but I think yours will probably be better. We have basically four issues. Should we accumulate information on, have we and should we accumulate information on casualties and killed in action? I think that's I'm summarizing a complex question, but how long will we neglect Iran? What are we doing about Iran? Why are we, is that another area that we're not focusing on sufficiently? How will the Iraq crisis affect or not affect the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Patriot Act? I think I'll just throw it open. Mike, would you like to comment on any of those or all of them?
I'll try the first one. And let me just try to say a couple of things about casualties in Iraq. And I think it relates to Tom's argument about the human rights rationale for the conflict. I want to say things that are contradictory, just to make it clear that I'm confused myself. One is that as a former Peace Corps volunteer in Congo, I was gratified to hear Paul Kennedy mention that example, to the extent that one wants to make the human rights argument in favor of intervention in Iraq, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. I think one has to say, why just Iraq or why primarily Iraq? It doesn't mean the war was a bad idea, but it does mean if you're going to be consistent, you have to view this as one case and get serious about helping deal with human rights abuses in other parts of the world. I have not yet seen the Bush administration do much of that. So I am critical of the Bush administration, even though I accept the humanitarian argument in Iraq. I don't see, for example, an idea the Clinton administration had, which was to create more capacity for peacekeeping among African militaries so that we wouldn't have to necessarily do as much ourselves, or because we weren't always going to intervene ourselves. But this was a good program. It was building up in the course of the Clinton years. The Bush administration could have really amplified it. They chose to suppress it. It's still there, but it's not any more ambitious than it was. Thankfully, we've had some progress on the peace front in some countries in Africa, but in others, of course, we have not. And so that's just one continent where the human rights issue is very real. So I hope that Mr. Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Cheney and others will actually make it clear they were sincere about the humanitarian argument in Iraq. Once they get this problem under control, if they're still in office, let's hope they think about other places. In terms of some of the numbers, Saddam Hussein was one of the great killers of the late 20th century. He was not on a scale of Hitler, but he was obviously instrumental in the Iran-Iraq war. course, at that time, we weren't so sure he was a bad guy. And the United States, in a realpolitik sense, thought that perhaps the Ayatollah was a greater danger than Saddam. But nonetheless, this war led to the deaths of at least 500,000 people and perhaps more. Mass grave sites. We visited mass grave sites in Iraq last week. The estimates now are that at least 300,000 Iraqis were killed in the course of Saddam's tenure by Saddam in massacres of one kind or another. We're all familiar with the gas attacks on the Kurds at Halabja and elsewhere, but the the entire countrywide total for the 25-year period in question is probably 300,000 to 500,000 people. Now, from a human rights perspective, you have to also ask, however, how much killing was still happening this year, and to what extent were we going in and trying to rewrite history or sort of get out our frustration with the terrible history of Saddam at a point when most of his worst killings were over. And I think one has to wrestle with that question. I think that the killings were continuing, but frankly at a lower pace than these huge numbers suggest. So I still think there was a humanitarian argument for overthrowing Saddam, but nonetheless, most of the killing was actually in the past. One more problem that opponents of the war have to wrestle with, and I'm not sure opponents wrestle with this enough, is the sanctions were a nightmare for the Iraqi people. We got ourselves into this box where we imposed sanctions on Iraq because we assumed Saddam would be smart enough to let us see that he had verifiably gotten rid of his weapons of mass destruction. Whether he still has them or not, he did not allow us to verify their elimination. And there's no serious debate about that point. And therefore, Saddam kept the sanctions in place by his own actions. But we were in a box because we were, of course, the ones that had imposed them. And therefore, in a sense, we had blood on our hands. And sustaining the status quo was a very dangerous policy for the people of Iraq. It was not necessarily as bad as the worst estimates you see, with many tens of thousands of children dying per year, but certainly the Iraqi standard of living and basic nutrition were worse as a result of sanctions, and at least several thousand, probably a couple tens of thousands of additional Iraqi deaths were occurring every year because of sanctions. In terms of the war casualties, of course, it's early to know what the results are, and I'll finish on this point, but it looks as if probably something on the order of 10,000 Iraqis died in combat. That's a very small number by comparison to all the other numbers I've cited. It's still tragically high. Any loss of life is tragically high, of course. But the war itself was relatively well done. And I actually think, I know human rights workers in various agencies who have agreed with that point in their preliminary findings. So what I've left you with is a lot of ammunition for both sides of the debate, I think, about whether the humanitarian argument should have led us to go and overthrow Saddam. And even if you do accept that, does it mean that you therefore have to get serious about other parts of the world where we've neglected the humanitarian rationale for greater involvement so far in this administration and, frankly, in virtually all of its predecessors?
Kathy Moon, would you like to comment on any of the questions posed? Perhaps a different question, but
No, I'll just piggyback on Mike's comment. Two thoughts about humanitarian policies based on humanitarian concerns and democracy building. I agree with you that the self-selective focus on Iraq as the humanitarian case for the U.S. is hypocritical, and that we do need to pay attention to other areas of the world where people have been suffering. But I'm loath to encourage the Bush administration too much in that direction, especially when I look at the situation in North Korea, where you can make a very good case for humanitarian-based military action, whether you're a liberal or whether you're conservative, and I would not go that route. And I think to give this administration that kind of firepower would be very dangerous. The other thought is that we talk about democracy building and reconstruction and the resources and energy needed in Iraq, but what's also interesting is that, and Professor Kennedy mentioned this, we're not only talking about military intervention in Iraq, we're talking about U.S. military reach all over the world and a redrawing of military ties to Central Europe, Central Asia, where small countries, poor countries, want to take on U.S. bases, house them, in return for aid, military technology, transfers, etc., but also for political legitimacy in their own countries. And in the case of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I'm not an expert on these areas, but I've done a little bit of reading where they're not savory deals necessarily. We might be talking about building democracy in Iraq, but we're also talking about overlooking anti-democratic tendencies in these kinds of countries where we want to use the areas for U.S. bases and military activities. So again, I think we can look at contradictions of the humanitarian/democracy-based policy intentions of this administration in multiple ways.
Tom, I hope you'll respond to the questions. But Mike raised the issue. If we accept the argument that Iraq was a human rights case in which we really had a moral obligation to intervene, what about all the other countries? And I'm sure that's one of the questions.
Yeah, that's actually where I was going to start. I've never been terribly persuaded by that argument because I know many people who are activists in many different causes, and they choose one cause and they work on that, and other people choose other causes and they work on that. I mean, to not intervene in a situation of injustice because there's other situations of injustice that you're either not prepared to at that moment or can't or won't, strikes me as very odd. So I'll answer that very. So there is some utilitarian issue as well, which is probably hypocritical on my part because Bentham was the biggest critic of human rights, referring to them as nonsense upon stilts, but he was also the father of utilitarianism. But you know, you intervene where you can. And, you know, it isn't always going to be perfect. I mean, I thought that the Rwanda genocide could have been averted through decisive intervention. It wouldn't have taken all that much. But it wasn't. It was, you know, and to bring that up, I was a part of a panel at the Holocaust Museum in Washington on genocide prevention, and somebody asked me, you know, how would you prevent genocide? I'd say, well, I'd get the United States to define all acts of genocide as part of the war on terror. You know, then there wouldn't be any genocide anymore. I was being facetious, of course. But, you know, that brings up the question, how much, and I think Kathy mentions this, I mean, how much power would you give the government, you know, to do just things, given your view of American politics and politicians and that kind of thing? And it's a question I really can't answer, but I do know that it's possible to do interventions. I just want to say one quick thing about Larry's point. It always has puzzled me as well that in most of arguments like yours, Larry, and other people who are concerned about the civilian dead, and we ought to be, that there wasn't much consideration of the civilian dead under Saddam Hussein's regime, or a sense of what the Iraqi people before the war thought, by and large, about what the cost would be. If you listen to Kana Makia or someone like that at Brandeis, the Iraqi dissident, you know, he was telling us the Iraqi people are ready to make this sacrifice. I mean, he's you know, whether he knows for sure or not, I don't know, but, you know, I doubt he was just making that up. How can you sit here, how can anybody sit here and say, we don't want to go to war, or we shouldn't go to war against Saddam because the civilians will die, when the civilians themselves are prepared, many civilians are prepared to do that? I mean, it's a conundrum, obviously, but, you know, I would raise that issue. And maybe I have other points, but
let's try to get as many people who want to speak as possible. Paul, would you like to make a comment in rebuttal, or should I think?
Well, just a brief one. I don't want to go back to was the war justified or not, and I don't really want to spend more time on. I think it is clear that the casualty rate inflicted by the Allies upon the Iraqi population in this past conflict was very small and was pretty principled according to jus in bello, just war, and we should be grateful at that. My point was an apprehension that if we cannot get relatively swiftly signs of progress in Iraq, in rebuilding of that society, and some signs of progress, thinking of the comment over here, in a Middle East peace settlement, then people of this country are going to get very turned off by calls that something should be done in West Africa, in East Africa, in Central Africa, in Indonesia, and a whole number of other places. So I'm thinking of the unintended consequences or the knock-on effects of not getting it right in Iraq could be seen in years' time as much, much more significant than the actual measure of what the Iraqi policies were.
Thanks. I'd like to take as many questions as we can squeeze in now. Please.
Hi, my name is Elaine Chang. I'm in the year 2004, and I believe that now, since the war's already, the military action have already taken place, we should really focus on development and reconstruction. And I know that Americans have keep drawing back on their previous experience with successful reconstruction in terms of in Japan, Germany, Taiwan, and South Korea. But I believe that American aid is crucial. However, part of the success contributes to the fact that those societies actually have a pretty structured government before they face like a war and destruction. So actually, I'm kind of suspicious about the fact that a democratic institution will fit a transitional economy like Iraq, because with its ethical diversity and the border that's drawn majorly by the Western power, I do not know how can a country be under one rulership, and I was doubted that democracy will actually be the best choice for Iraq, at least at this very moment. Could you comment on that? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Hello. I have a question in light of a recent news break. Since the decolonization of the Middle East and the redrawing of nation lines by European powers, the Kurds have had no place to call home in a sovereign sense. And as Mr. O'Hanlon mentioned, they were targeted by Saddam during his regime. But how can the U.S. justify the humanitarian reasons for use of force in Iraq in light of this injustice towards the Kurds, and also in light of a recent agreement with Iraq's neighbor Jordan? Jordan, from what I understand, will send troops into Iraq to help with reconstruction if in return the U.S., in addition to other things, will help put down Kurd rebellions in that country. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Takis.
Thank you very much for a very nice panel, but I still have one question that I would love to have your help answering, because you see, one of those believers of democracy, and I know that democracy above all means trust to those elected. That's darn important. I also have quite a few friends who believe the same things, but they are a little cynical. You see, when the war was going to happen, they were calling me and they were saying, come on, don't be fooled. It's not really about weapons of mass murder. It's really, you cannot, they were telling me, hide a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon as a pocket knife. The people who are inspectors there, they can find it. So I was, would like to tell them they were wrong. And they said, no, this thing is about the oil, really. So a few months down the road, 6 months down the road, when there are no weapons of mass murder found, and contracts after contracts are being allocated to companies like Halliburton, and there is so much despair about the effects of sabotage on the oil pipeline, and more money needs to go into create this infrastructure that produce again this oil. I'm really terrified at my telephone. You see, I have this caller ID, and my friends are calling me, and I know that they will ask me that. So, what should I tell them?
I'd like to ask everybody to make their comments quick. We're going to end in about 6 minutes, so
That's a tough question to follow. My question is...
Oh, there's a mic. Excuse me. I'll get you next. Please go ahead.
Sure. My question is, I grew up with grandparents who loved President Roosevelt, and he addressed the nation like Churchill via the radio. And both, I believe, Churchill and Roosevelt asked for sacrifice. My resentment towards George Bush is that he misrepresented this country with the reasons for war, in my opinion. That's my deep opinion. My question is, and I do think it's derisive now because of these lies and because of the facts that are coming out about the lies. My question is, what is it that you would recommend American citizens to be sacrificing for a better future for the United Nations and for the world.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize there was a mic up there. Please go ahead.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. The panel is mostly addressing human rights, which is a good thing to do, but we're sort of forgetting that the war is also very much about oil. So I'd like the panel to address some of that and how that factors in.
Thanks. Nargis.
Hi. I have a quick comment and a quick question. As Professor Moon said, we must be in touch with Iraq as opposed to out of touch. And I think it would have been beneficial to be able to also hear from an Iraqi expert on the panel, just to kind of get to know, since this is about about America and Iraq 6 months after. That my question has to do with democracy building that we were talking about, especially Professor Cushman. That democracy, in my belief, is not something that can be implemented from the outside, but something that has to be experimented from the inside. And I don't quite understand how Iraq can be rebuilt and reconstructed without the U.S. acting or looking like a colonial power. And if you have any thoughts towards that, thank you.
Please. I hope you don't mind. You can take notes, but I want to get everybody's comments in, and then we'll have a last round through with you guys. Go ahead.
I guess this question would be addressed to Michael. There's been the suggestion in the American media that Saddam had a guerrilla war in mind to begin with, and that the suggestion now is to leave insurgent forces in place, would have them contact Iranian and Syrian forces, which would further destabilize the situation. And if you could comment on how valid that would be, that might be helpful. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
I was wondering if the panel could address specific policy recommendations for how you would rebuild Iraq. Specifically, what role would you like to see the UN play? What are the priorities for the $87 billion? And how would you promote self-governance in a very specific way?
Thank you.
As an American military dependent in Japan, I lived there for 2 years on Okinawa, which I'm sure everybody has heard about. I really have one question. Does anybody really believe that we're going to be out in 5 years and that we won't be there 50 years later?
Thank you.
Hi, I was taken by one of or two of Professor Cushman's comments, phrases, sort of asking how we cannot intervene in situations of injustice, nor abandon people to some unbeknownst fate. And what struck me was just sort of thinking about sort of the state of affairs in the United States, particularly with poverty and lack of education and funding for it and the lack of health care. I am from a city that just had a $4.5 billion cut for the one charity hospital that treats gunshot wounds, like it's the #1 gunshot wound hospital. And my question was posed for Professor Kennedy, who was speaking of the necessity of sacrifice, and what I wanted to ask is whether or not this concern that I have for the state of the United States itself and sort of ensuring democracy for our own people should be considered or not when we're thinking of scaling down the vast array of political commitments that we have, and what way to go about sort of bettering democracy in the United States.
Thanks. Two more, and then we'll have a wrap up with the group.
I was wondering if you could speak to the effect that the position we find ourselves in now has on the doctrine of preemptive strikes, and what, if that's now dead with the lack of trust we now have in the government and the facts that they presented to us, what replaces that, or what do we revert back to?
Thank you. That's a good question. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak. You talked a little bit, Professor Cushman specifically, about the humanitarian reasons for going to war. I'd also like maybe if you could talk about some of the domestic reasonings for going to war, and maybe how the restructuring of the U.S. military infrastructure more towards outsourcing and private industry has influenced going to war, and how that was run, how it's been run in Iraq. Anyone can speak on that.
All right, that's I counted 12 very good, complicated questions. Now, there's no way we're going to answer all of them. Here's what I propose. I'm going to ask the panelists to pick one or two that they would like to comment on. Following that, I think that will take us past 9 o'clock. We have some drinks and some snacks outside, which I'd like you to have a chance to talk to the panelists. But we won't go much past about another 10 minutes or so. So I'll ask the panelists to be fairly brief. Unless you want to harangue them afterwards, which I hope you do, why don't we begin again with Mike?
Thanks. And by the way, again, it's a treat to be here. And these are great questions and very helpful to me. And I get a chance to be in a meeting with Rumsfeld tomorrow, so you're going to inspire me to ask him some of these questions.
So now you really want to get him in the reception.
So I'm just going to go quickly on a few of these. On the issue of was it about oil? In one sense, it is partly about oil, not so much in the sense of Halliburton, but Saddam Hussein with a nuclear weapon in the Middle East would have been a big problem for Western security because the guy was a risk taker. And had he ever gotten that nuclear weapon, he might have again thought he was therefore free to aggress with relative impunity. Now, I happen to think he was a long ways away from that nuclear weapon, and on that issue, that's where I'm really upset about Bush's use of intelligence. On chemical and biological arms, we were all wrong. I was wrong, the Clinton administration was wrong, the UN was wrong, the French were wrong, we all got it wrong. Or maybe we didn't, and maybe we'll find out later that we were right, but I doubt it. So I don't blame Bush too much for that. But on the nuclear thing, he did hype the threat. It was not as imminent, and people who looked hard at the data knew it wasn't that imminent. But had Saddam ever gotten a nuclear weapon, or Uday or Qusay or what have you, then it would have been potentially a problem because oil is important to Western economic interests, and Saddam could have threatened much of Persian Gulf stability. However, I do not believe this was about getting American firms access to oil for two reasons. One, it's a real bad bargain, if that's the bargain. We're spending, last year and this year combined, $150 billion on Iraq. And, you know, the benefit of having Iraq back in the oil market is quite minimal so far. Now, for individuals at Halliburton, it may be beneficial, but for that reason, among others, Mr. Bush's popularity and his credibility with the American public, which used to be his greatest asset, have taken a big hit. And Dick Cheney has become, in many ways, a net liability when he used to be, in many ways, a net asset. So I don't think they would have gone to war for Halliburton. And it was not a good deal for the American taxpayer. It wasn't a good deal for Mr. Bush politically. In that sense, it was not about oil. Another issue about Saddam's strategy, did he have a strategy of counterinsurgency to lure us into the cities? A lot of us thought this. And, but if that's his strategy, he's implemented it in an extraordinarily ineffective way. He's losing. Both his sons are dead. 40-some of his top 50-some officials and commanders are arrested or dead. He himself is probably living like a goat shepherd in one of the huts I flew over last week. This is not Saddam's. I also was in 4 or 5 of his palaces. Believe me, I think we can all guess where he'd rather be at the moment. If his strategy was to somehow maximize his own interest, and I may be caricaturing the question, so I apologize, but if his strategy was to maximize his own interest, he should have verifiably allowed us to see where all the precursor materials that he purchased were located. He could have avoided this war. Bush would have been upset, Cheney would have been upset, Wolfowitz would have been disappointed if Saddam had verifiably allowed us to see that he had disarmed, but he didn't do it, and therefore they got their excuse to go to war. And to some extent, it was an excuse. But it was also one that Saddam had the power to get away from us, and he chose not to. Another point, how long will we stay? 5 years or 50 years? I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we have a military alliance with some kind of a post-Saddam Iraq, but it's going to be at the decision of the Iraqi people. They're going to have the power to either accept or expel us. Now, I know in Okinawa, an issue I've also studied, a lot of Okinawans would rather have Americans gone. On the other hand, a lot of Okinawans would also be happy to have Americans stay, and Japan as a country has decided to have Americans stay. Within a few years, Iraq will have the same choice. Doctrine of preemption, I'm almost done. Doctrine of preemption, I think the Bush administration itself, in their most candid moments, if you really could give them truth serum, they would admit it was a bad idea to talk about this. It made it harder to do anything else they wanted to do because it made the whole rest of the world wonder, what's next? Who's next? And it made countries like France see us as a greater threat to world peace than Saddam Hussein. This was a totally counterproductive doctrine, even if your goal was to overthrow Saddam. So I don't think the administration, so therefore your question is valid, because I don't really believe, even though it's still on paper, a doctrine, I don't believe it is taken seriously. Now, yeah, sure, if somebody's about to mount a strike from Syria and we find out about it next week, yes, we will preempt. But we didn't need a preemption doctrine to give us that power. Any other American president in this position would have done the same thing without that doctrine. I'll just take one more. The
Mike,
issue of...
I want to give everybody a fair shake, so 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah. Last one. Iraq, the issues of the Kurdish rights, issues of Iraqi democracy. I think the Kurds, by the way, are pretty happy with where they stand now, in Iraq anyway. We're not going to suppress any Kurdish movements in any other countries. Dave Petraeus, our old classmate, is working very hard with the Kurdish groups. They are cooperating. They are no longer sparring amongst themselves. They are having their way of life improve dramatically. This is the most hopeful development for the Kurdish people in quite some time, and I hope we find a way to protect their rights within a future federal and stable Iraq. But the situation looks pretty good. Will Iraqi democracy as a whole take? I don't know. It's a great question, and we'll be asking that question if we have a forum like this in a year or two. It's going to be hard, but I don't see what else you shoot for in this situation. If I could think of the perfect benign, benevolent strongman who is ready to be installed and could therefore establish stability in Iraq, would I accept that as an outcome? Heck yes. Do I know how to make that happen any more than democracy? No. Therefore, democracy is the only thing we can sort of justify in terms of human rights and values, and it's what we have to shoot for.
Thank you. I like the idea of a truth serum administered to the Bush administration, as you put it. I would produce all kinds of interesting comments. We could start with Clinton, exactly. Kathy, would you like to comment?
Sure.
Are you sure?
Yes, it just the questions just reminded me of how it's not easy to teach at Wellesley College, because we do get good questions. And I had a really good class today too, so I feel very, very lucky to have this additional challenge. To Takis, your question about your telephone dilemmas and your friends calling about oil, turn the phone off. My colleague there in computer science always has the best sense of humor. I think the oil issue, I agree with Mike. It's not about oil, it is about oil. And I think that I actually was very critical of I'm a good liberal, I'm a Democrat. I was very opposed to the war prior to its beginning and remain critical. But I became very upset when my good liberal friends would talk about oil, as a way to diss or criticize the Bush administration, because I think in some ways that is the most hypocritical thing for all Americans. Liberal, conservative, doesn't matter. We are dependent on oil. I would have preferred to have seen the administration come out and say, we're going into Iraq for oil. I think that would have been a much more honest way to go. And I probably couldn't have come up with, a lot of dissenting or smart ways to talk about it. Meaning, we don't do much about our oil dependence. So what's the point of criticizing this administration for having oil interests if we want to have free-flowing oil from the Middle East at cheap rates, which we do? So I think for those of us who are good liberals who criticize the war and the administration, we need to criticize ourselves for picking a very easy target of criticism. Somebody mentioned, what do we need to sacrifice as a nation for perhaps Iraqi reconstruction as well as probably world peace, I think you were going to. And that's too huge a question, but I just found this on my email list today, came through a listserv, a recent study that was done of leading polls, and people found that prior to the war and after the war, that the people American public, the people who tended to have the most misperceptions in terms of factual information about Iraq tended to support the war the most. And that if you got your news source from Fox TV in particular, you were more bound to be misinformed and therefore supportive of the war. Regardless of what your media source is, I think it's worth the sacrifice of time and energy and brain cells churning to actually go diversify your information sources, regardless of whether you're a conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. And Takis also mentioned trust being an important part of democracy. Yes, but I think distrust is healthy distrust. Healthy cynicism is also a good thing, meaning that we shouldn't trust everything we read or see on TV, obviously, as well as some of the information that has been coming out of the government for obvious reasons lately. So if that's a sacrifice to go learn more, I think it's a sacrifice worth engaging in. Somebody raised a question of whether democracy can really grow, flourish in Iraq. Someone mentioned that you need to have internal origination and development. I guess you're looking at sort of an organic approach. And I would argue that very few democracies grew organically. Maybe the British democracy is one of the few rare examples. Most cases, democracy got imposed from the outside, or at least was the shock factor or the jolt factor came from external sources. Somebody mentioned Germany, Japan, South Korea as showcases for democracy. They took a very, very long time, and they were indeed imposed by the outside. So I think if we're expecting any short-term changes in Iraq, I think we're all mistaken, and we might have to set our standards quite low for some time. Iraq is in an unfortunate situation because during the Cold War, Germany, Japan, South Korea, their democracies, maybe I won't include Germany, but definitely Japan and South Korea, they were allowed to have compromised democracies, and in the case of Korea, authoritarianism outright, as long as they serviced the interests of the United States and Western powers to support the Cold War. So democracy got interpreted in very different ways. In Iraq, all eyes are on Iraq. I don't think Iraq has a whole lot of leeway, and a lot of people will be coming up with multiple standards of judging democracy, so it's a tougher task. Democracy building also tends to work better when there is regional support. We know this from Latin America, we know this in East Asia. The problem in the Middle East is even if you build Iraq as a functioning democracy in terms of institutions, the question is how viable is it in the long term in a region where democracy has not taken root? And I think it's a serious question. My last point is somebody mentioned, we went into Iraq for the oil. No, we went in for weapons of mass destruction. No, the other item that the administration told us was Iraq's link to Al-Qaeda. None of these things we know for sure. But I think we went into the Middle East, we went into Iraq because we were able to go into Iraq. And I think that's a very different situation in other parts of the world. For example, North Korea. You have regional neighbors to North Korea who don't like North Korea, but who refuse to have the United States take military action as a viable alternative. We did not have that kind of I don't want to say coalition, but a bulwark in the Middle East. We didn't have Middle Eastern resistance in terms of governments being able to stand up to the United States or have some other alternative to offer. So I think there are multiple reasons for having entered the war, and I just hope that we can do a good job of rebuilding Iraq and getting the troops out.
These kids have homework, so they have to be in bed. Of course. And I just want to urge...
We have homework too, we have to teach.
I know. I'd just like to urge Tom and Paul, who have to take their time and use it well.
Okay, gotcha. I'll try to be brief. I will. I just would say, I'd say, one of the whole, I'll start with the preemptive self-defense very quickly to say that's a very complicated issue. There is a whole legal tradition and customary international law of what's called anticipatory self-defense, which I would commend you to if you really want to do some reading about the legality of that. There's some interesting cases. It's not a new notion by any stretch of the imagination. There's been cases in American history as back as 1831, and you can look at this body of law. So I urge people to look at that body of law before they assume that George Bush invented the idea of anticipatory self-defense. There are three dangers that I see in explanations and views about the war, at least dangers from my point of view, obviously. The one is excessive cynicism. I don't believe there's such a thing as healthy cynicism. Cynicism is by its nature degradatory. It tries to bring things down to a kind of level of sameness, and nothing has any value. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, "Cynic knows the cost of everything but the value of nothing." But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be skeptical. I think there's a very different position on skepticism. I'm very skeptical about the arguments that the regime, there's a Freudian slip for you, that the administration puts forward. Freudian slip.
Truth serum.
Now you know what I really think. Anyway, of course I'm skeptical. They botched it. They didn't ring the right bells, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think excessive cynicism is something I see a lot of, and especially left liberal intellectuals. And I don't think that's a good quality of mind for a liberal. I think skepticism is a necessary quality of mind. So I would urge people, to be cautious of excessive cynicism. The second problem is reductionism and explanation, of reducing a complex social event to one or the other cause. I mean, it's about oil, it's about the, social life is complex. That's why we invented sociology, to try to figure it out. Political science too, I guess, but no, it's complex. So I think reductionism is something to be cautioned against, and try to be sophisticated. I mean, it's not about this or that. The third thing, and I'll probably end on this, is that fixing problems in this country, according to some liberal agenda, is not incompatible with a liberal internationalist, even interventionist foreign policy. They're both parts of the same liberal project. I mean, so I don't see any problem with that. And the danger there, I think, and especially in this rhetoric that will be there for 50 years, I think it would be interesting to go back and look at other cases where we intervene to see if people are making those same arguments. I think the problem there is that, it turns into, this is the issue, neo-isolationism. And that's what I worry about with the Democrats, to be perfectly honest, is that, they're really arguing for some kind of isolationism, or at least that's what I hear. I mean, maybe, and so I think those are three dangers, and who knows how long we'll be there, but to abandon hope is, I think, excessively problematic from a liberal standpoint.
Thanks, Tom. Paul, you have the last word, as you so often do. The big picture, please.
If you keep putting me at the end of the line, I obviously have a last word. Preemption. You might want to look at the really interesting speech by Kofi Annan last week when he opened the General Assembly, in which he said that essentially that all member states of the United Nations in signing the Charter had given up that except in the case of an imminent and close threat to their homeland. That's it. U.S. sacrifices, like the civic sacrifices I believe someone asked about Roosevelt calling for, get rid of the idea of this further tax cut, which is so stacked up in one direction. If you want to pump prime the American economy, give everybody, rich or poor, a little voucher for $150. But don't do it the tax cut way, where somebody who earns $10 million will get $450,000 additional dollars cut from the tax. Some military cuts, I wouldn't say military cuts on the personnel. We are overstrained and overstretched. But we certainly, with the best fighter aircraft in the world, do not now need contracts for 3 different competing fighter aircrafts, which the military-industrial complex is pushing for. Cut some of the absurd form of agricultural subsidies, which are just damaging the third world beyond belief. And those 3 alone would be a sizable dent in the growing budget deficit. One final word, because Professor Hitchcock, I had 3 or 4 people expressing kind of gloom or worry or pessimism about a reconstruction and democracy in Iraq. Of course it looks horrendous now, but it's worth recalling that in the last 12 years, various and sometimes very large UN peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions have led to success stories. We always get told about Kosovo or Mogadishu or Rwanda. We rarely get asked to look at what happened in Namibia, which was a long, long struggle. We rarely get asked to look at what happened in Cambodia or in East Timor or in the peace process and the return of democracy in the Central American republics. From each of these, you might be able, without thinking there's a template that fits all cultures and fits all geographies, from each of these, you might well be able to extract some operating principles which help. But the people who can best do that are those who were involved in the reconstruction processes before, and they turn out to be United Nations agencies, and they cannot operate without security. So you then come around in a circle to say you need security, but you also need this idea of going ahead for reconstruction. And the reconstruction, I would suggest, should be thought of in terms of not just a national council, but what would be the best form of rather more decentralized administration to allow for these ethnic differences, to allow for the Marsh Arabs in the south and the Kurds in the north. Can you think of going back to the old Arab vilayet system or Swiss canton system? There is a prospect there. It's not all total gloom and doom, to be pleased to hear.
I think it's pretty clear we need more panels like this. It seems to me that we have engaged just the tip of the iceberg.
I'd like to thank Will Hitchcock for organizing this. He did a lot of work on this. I'd like to thank him.